just some references here. I'm going to hand it off to Steve right now.
All right, good morning, everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit about long-term management in the Iwilei District area. So first, let's talk about what constitutes the Iwilei District. A lot of times you're going to have various definitions, but for the purposes of this talk, we're talking essentially from Waikamilo Road, which is near Piers 39 and 40, that's the Young Brothers, all the way to King Street, where pretty much you're close to Ala Parkside. Those are the two Eva and Diamond Head boundaries. The Mackay boundary is Honolulu Harbor itself, and the Mauka boundary, I believe, is Dillingham Boulevard. So just so you know, that's all you that's what you see on your screen now. The reddish areas that you see are related to Honolulu Harbor and their respective operating units. All right. So a little history about the Iwilei District itself. It constitutes roughly 315 acres with multiple land users and responsible parties in it. As most of us know from the history of this site, it is mainly industrial, commercial type of usage, bulk food terminals, an MGP, a manufactured gas processing site, and several active and inactive pipelines that were connected to the harbor over the years that are underneath the streets, as well as many of the parcels themselves. Dole Cannery, the actual pineapple cannery itself, was in operation in this area. And pretty much you have a lot of what we call contaminated field issues. There was a Chinatown fire that occurred at the turn of the other century before this one. And so what you have is a lot of contaminated debris and fill throughout this area. So before we start, it's sort of one way to look at it is how do we address sites in general within the HEER office? And this goes back to our statutes, which is the Environmental Response Law, which is HRS 128D as in dog. But in conjunction with that, we have a Hawaii Administrative Rule 11451, which is known as the State Contingency Plan. And pretty much this administrative rule is meant to help us. It's the how-to make sure we're complying with the HRS, the statute that we're talking about. So within the, sorry. No. So what we're doing today, we're going to explain a little bit about that process that we go through in the state contingency plan, and that's the remedial process. So as you can see from this diagram, you start off with typically what people may call a phase one at times, where it's a historic records review. What was used on the property? What were the historic uses? What was operated on that property? Followed typically by a site investigation. And then this is where these terms start to come in, where it's an environmental hazard evaluation, which we'll get to in a little bit. Followed by a remedial alternatives analysis, which is akin to the CERCLA version of a feasibility study. A response action memo, which is equivalent to a ROD, or record of decision in CERCLA. And so those two, the remedial alternatives analysis, sort of outlays the different types of remedies we can take for a particular site. The response action memo has more to do with the final decision as to what remedy was selected. And that's why we get to that the last box of selected remedy. And oftentimes, since we rarely get to areas where we can clean it to pristine or to its original state, oftentimes we have to do what's called risk-based closures, where we're leaving contamination left on site. And because of that, it often requires some form of long-term management. And this is where that term environmental hazard management plan comes into play, where it helps us with our long-term management of these sites where we know we're leaving behind residual contamination. What you see here in this next picture is what we call a conceptual site model. Whenever we do an investigation, one of the main things we want to know is who's going to get affected by this contamination and what pathway is going to be the most likely pathway to affect these people. So as you can see here, this is a various picture of the quote-unquote receptors, those that are affected, and media, like soil or groundwater or soil vapor. So you always look at the two receptors, and the media that's affecting them. And then we're going to talk a little bit about pathway. So this one here, this next slide is pretty much about pathways, where you have in the yellow blocks the media itself, the air, the soil, and the groundwater. And what you see here is all the different pathways of how it can affect receptors. So the soil, you can affect things through gross contamination versus human health, direct exposure type things. Indoor air is about vapor intrusion. But you also have those same things happening when it comes with groundwater, where you can also have gross contamination issues. You can have aquatic habitats that are affected and vapor intrusion issues as well. So what you're having here is the media and the types of pathways that it can affect people. And so because all of these pathways are different, you're going to have action levels that correspond with these specific pathways. And so in addition to petroleum type contamination, we also run into a lot of lead and pesticides. So this is pretty much the same picture again. So, yep, sorry. So moving right along. Environmental hazard evaluation. That's what an EHE is. That's the term that we use within our office. And a lot of the EHEs that we do are very much like the remedial investigations we perform in a circular process type of site or federal type site that EPA would manage. And in this report, you often have site background. You have a summary of previous investigations that have already been done on the property. You have what's called a comparison of site data to action levels. Within the state of Hawaii, we have a technical guidance manual and to be considered criteria. They're not really laws, they're really guidance in terms of action levels we want people to follow for specific types of contamination. We refer to them as our EALs, our environmental action levels. So that's what it refers to when it says action levels in that bullet. So the EHE is supposed to identify for us what pathways are the ones that you have trouble with. And it tells you that by going back to those two diagrams you saw before and seeing whether or not the concentrations of those contaminants exceed the action levels for those pathways. And so when we do that, we can tell at a preliminary level often, because what the action levels are screening levels, it tells you you potentially have a problem. And so what you have to do after that is do what we refer in that fifth bullet as an advanced evaluation of targeted hazards, where we take it often to a risk assessment, or what we used to do maybe 10 years ago was take it to a site-specific tier 2 level. And what we do is we analyze whether or not those levels that exceeded our original environmental action levels to see if they truly pose a hazard to the receptors we think are being affected. And finally, we draw conclusions and recommendations based off of what our risk assessments say about those contamination levels and the receptors. Which moves us to our next part about environmental hazard management plans. This is really what the main body of our talk should be about, because a lot, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of times, because we do what's called risk-based corrective actions, or RBCA, we're leaving residual contamination behind. It doesn't prevent a property from being used, but there's often are conditions that need to be preserved or maintained to ensure that it never, or not never, but does not become a hazard to these receptors we mentioned in the environmental hazard evaluation. So that's why a lot of times this goes hand in hand with that environmental hazard evaluation. The evaluation tells you what pathways are the ones that you need to address. The plan, the environmental hazard management plan, tells you how you will address those pathways. And so, again, it's usually broken down by media, meaning soil, groundwater, and indoor air type systems, where if you have those pathways being open or those pathways of being of concern, the plan helps train you or tell you what you need to do to address them or to prevent them from becoming a problem. So when it comes to environmental hazard management plans, there's three types really that we'll be talking about. The first one is called a pre-construction plan. And in these, the most common time you see these is when a parcel hasn't been fully investigated yet, but you know that the construction guys, the guys that are going to be out there digging trenches, putting in utilities, laying down foundational work, putting in piles, that they may run into some contamination on the property just from historic use. So oftentimes, just as a precaution and as a safety aspect, what we do is we have the responsible party produce a pre-construction environmental hazard management plan. A site-specific management plan is one where a full investigation has been done. The site has gone through the remedial process that I mentioned in a few slides earlier. A selected remedy has been done, and now that this environmental management plan is what the responsible party has to enforce in order to keep the site, quote unquote, safe. If the plan is violated in some shape, way, or form, usually we'll come back. We potentially may say as the department that you had remedy failure, in which case we may ask the responsible party to take a response action to address the issue, to bring it back into a state where it does not pose a hazard or risk to human health. And finally, the last type of EHMP is what we call a programmatic EHMP. Now, this type of EHMP is different from the other two because oftentimes when we do investigations on these sites, they're border to border. We only really investigate within the site or parcel itself. There are instances when we chase off-site contamination, but more often than not, a lot of the sites we do, when we investigate them, it's for the parcel itself. And we don't always go beyond the boundaries of that parcel. So what happens is you have what we call gaps, streets, common areas, places where it's unclear what contamination is there. We may suspect it is there because we know that property boundaries do not stop contamination from coming into the street. So what we did was we came up with this concept of a programmatic EHMP that's sort of proactive, where we're trying to help utilities mainly, because those are the guys that you usually see in the street, to help them address contamination they may run into in the course of performing the actions they have to do, whatever emergency action they need to do to fix a pipe or replace a light pole, telephone pole, electric pole. When they have to take these activities, we want this type of EHMP in place so they know what to do in case they should encounter contamination in an area that hasn't been investigated. So right now I'm going to turn over the talk to Jordan. He's going to talk a little bit about a site-specific EHMP in the Iwilei area, the Lowe's site.
Hey everyone. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, the current Lowe's in Honolulu, Hawaii is located along Nimitz Highway, kind of in the heart of this whole Iwilei District. And it's at the location of a former bulk fuel storage facility. So as we can all assume, there is a lot of petroleum contamination at the property prior to construction. So based off of the EHE that was developed for the site, some of the pathways, we had gross contamination in regards to your petroleum range contaminants. Also vapor intrusion hazards posed by what was from the soil data, as well as the groundwater. There's also a risk of benzene migration onto the site from the adjacent Gasco MGP site. And finally, the whole thing with the discharge to surface waters. As part of the construction of this site, a new storm drain was required. and all the construction involved with that, along with sealing the storm drain. You had the whole risk of runoff from the site getting in there and reaching surface waters. So part of this site, we had, the idea was to reduce vapor intrusion hazards along with the gross contamination. This was done through excavating the soil and treating it on site via thermal desorption, along with removal actions. Work required included the installation of a new storm drain and a passive soil vapor venting system below the building and below the slab. So a pre-construction EHMP was developed for all the conditions that were existing at the site, following or prior to all the construction work being done, as well as a post-construction EHMP for all the conditions following installation of the soil vapor barrier, passive venting system, and removal of all the soil and capping the site. Here we have some photos of the installation of the soil vapor venting system and the vapor membrane. You can take a look there. And here are just some more pictures of some of the work being done for the installation of the passive venting system. On the photo in the bottom left, you can kind of see what it looks like almost towards the end of construction as they were finishing up installation of the barrier, as well as backfilling and regrading and repaving the site. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Steve. He's going to talk about our programmatic Iwilei EHMP.
So thank you, Jordan. So what we talked about with that low site is indicative of a lot of sites in the area where investigations were done, cleanups were performed, and site-specific environmental hazard management plans were put in place to address what was on the property. But now we have to take it to what we talked about a little bit earlier as to what about the streets in between these parcels? What about the common areas in between these parcels? How do we address that? How do we look out for in areas that haven't truly been investigated yet, but we're fairly confident we know there's something there? So what we came up with was an idea that for this entire Iwilei area was that we sort of already knew from all the different sites we were going through that petroleum contamination was an issue within this whole area. No matter wherever you dug a hole or put a hole in, you'd probably hit some free product or some stained soil of some form in this area. So instead of saying poke a hole in every single 100 feet or 10 feet within this area, we just acknowledge that fact that this area has probably a significant amount of gross contamination in it. And so taking what we said earlier about being a proactive approach, saying, hey, we think you're going to hit something if you dig in the street. So please take these precautions. Please follow these contingency plans so that your workers are safe and you can dispose of the contaminated media properly. So having said that, as you can tell, things can get confusing really quickly when there's 3 different types of environmental hazard management plans. So the first thing we need to understand is that the programmatic EHMP does not trump a site-specific EHMP. The site-specific EHMP was developed after a rigorous investigation of the property's been done. Programmatic EHMPs, like I said, are for areas where we're just it's more like hedging your bet, assuming that, hey, you're probably going to hit something in there. It truly hasn't gone through an investigative process. That's why I'll always defer to a site-specific EHMP. The second thing about it is you can't use it as a get out of jail free card for your RP for a site that you already have. Thirdly, you still have to follow other state laws and rules that are in place for those areas.
Okay.
Sorry. So what are the key features when we look at an EHMP? Specifically a programmatic EHMP is it gives you detailed instructions as to how to deal with the media, whether it be groundwater, soil vapor. It also has short forms in the back to help you with reporting these releases or these types of issues you're running into to the HEER office directly. Because part of what the statute states, the 128D statute asks for, is that when you encounter this type of media or when you encounter contamination in one of these media, you must report it to us. Failure to report it to us would result in what's a notice of violation. So in order to prevent that, or in order to avoid getting slapped with one of those, these short forms allow you to jot down the information you need so that you don't get hit with a violation, and gives us the information we need to move forward. And like I said, you get a lot of contingency plans in this management plan for any contractor. Because we're placing it on the website now, and it is available as a hard copy upon request, contractors can know ahead of time what to do, even before they set out in their plans. Because we know that construction plans, just by their very nature, are fluid and they can take place at any time. By giving this plan to you in advance, now you can incorporate this into your actual construction plans to avoid issues you may run into. And finally, it helps us with consistency for managing petroleum sites overall, because the types of contingency plans in it and the types of directions and guidance we give you in it are consistent with all other types of petroleum contaminated sites we run into. Finally, like I just mentioned, the EHMP is available to people at our website. So please just click on that link. If you want an actual hard copy of it, you can contact Jordan directly through his email.
Oh, and now we're just going to open things up for some questions. If anybody has any, feel free to submit using the Q&A function on your screen. And so far we don't have any, so I guess that's good. It must have been pretty clear in terms of explaining everything. But yeah, we'll just leave this open for a few minutes for questions. And here on this next slide here, I'm gonna just go back to the original slide you folks probably saw when you logged on. Just talking about upcoming webinars. So feel free to contact Roger if you want to be added to the list for the invites to be sent out. The next one we have planned for May 11th, 2015. That is a Monday from 12 to 1 Hawaii time. Steve Negro and Kelly Smith, some folks from the mainland, they work for Regenesis and Land Science Tech. They'll be down here giving a presentation, just kind of discussing some new technologies that they have. Oh, we got some questions, and we'll pop those up. Okay. Just going through these. The first one, are there other neighborhoods with programmatic EHMPs, and are there others in the works?
That's an excellent question. Right now, it's no to the first question and yes to the second. And part of what we're trying to do is we're trying to see whether or not it's better to make it contaminant specific or usage specific. What I mean by that is the current one, the Iwilei one that we're using, is petroleum specific. So let's say we want to do one for pesticides later, right? Where former ag lands, we want to address them that way. We could potentially develop an ag land programmatic EHMP. And so that's what's currently in the works. Okay, the second question, right? It says, oh, can they all see that? I'm sorry, I'm being stupid.
Oh, No. So the second question is asking, is this EHMP something that can be used for large construction projects, or do those projects need to prepare their own EHMP?
The main thing about this specific EHMP is meant for mainly small projects. Larger projects, if it's going to be really involved with a lot of dealing with soil or groundwater, we'd probably want you guys to come in and talk to us about it before you take the action.
Okay. Third question just popped up here is asking if the programmatic EHMP is closer to a pre-construction EHMP or more of a site-specific EHMP.
It's closer to a pre-construction EHMP. That's an excellent question because it's sort of like it works under the same premise that a true full investigation has not been performed yet. So it's like the term I use, hedging your bet, that I don't know for sure if there's something there, but just in case, take these precautions.
Okay. All right, another question here. What is Hawaii Department of Health's policy on requiring land use controls, either institutional controls or engineering controls, as discussed in the EHMP, to be recorded in property deeds?
Actually, there's another legislation that was created to address that. That's Chapter 508C, our Uniform Environmental Covenants Act. So right now, technically speaking, the UECA is a voluntary agreement. And so what happens is that oftentimes we want certain properties to have it where we know that the contamination won't be going away anytime in our lifetimes. So in those times, we usually negotiate it out with the RPs to make sure that these types of EHMPs run with the property.
Some other questions here. What are some examples of EHMPs next to coastal areas? Specifically, how does the EHMP integrate plans from other agencies?
The EHMPs we currently have near coastal areas are the ones we have in the Honolulu Harbor area, where we do have site-specific EHMPs in the works for those operable units. Oh, whoops, what up?
Oh, no,
sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Oftentimes, if there's another statute or law in play, the EHMP cannot trump that law. So those laws have to take precedence over it. A good example is, let's say you had petroleum and it hit ocean water. Even though there may be an EHMP for that site, OPA, the Oil Pollution Act, is regulated by the Coast Guard, and in that specific case, it'd be addressed by the Coast Guard. We'd have to defer to the Coast Guard and what actions they want taken.
Again, it looks like we have one more question here before we close out. So if you have any other questions, feel free to submit them now, but we're going to answer this last one here.
AUL.
And
What is it?
it says, how does the Hawaii Department of Health view a site-specific EHMP that may impose AULs on adjacent properties not owned by the PRP? So I guess offsite.
How does the DOH view a site-specific that may impose AULs on adjacent properties?
We'll answer this one later.
Yeah, we're going to.
Okay, we'll get back to you on this question. If anyone's interested to answer for this question, we can submit it via email.
Okay.
So we'll take one more here, and
we'll take that one.
Okay, so the question is, what is the process or requirement for construction and utility firms to report encountering contamination in common areas?
Whenever they do their intrusive activities, if they should encounter contamination in the course of those activities, they need to call it in to the HEER office as a release notification.
Okay. So that'll kind of close off our Q&A session. The rest of the questions that are here, we will try to respond via email, or feel free to contact me with any of these questions that you may have. Apologize for us not being able to get to them. But once again, I just want to thank everyone here for joining us for this webinar, and I hope it's beneficial for you folks as it is for us to kind of get the word out about things we do here. So thank you again, and look forward to having you join us for our next one on May 11th. Thank you.
Yeah, what we got? Ooh, how many more we got to answer? So what's that?